My daughter-in-law called me a slut at my son's wedding reception in front of 300 guests at the Palmer House Hilton. What she didn't know was that starting Monday morning, I would become her father's boss. Let me back up. My name is Margaret Albuquerque. I'm 73 years old, and I've spent the last 50 years building something from nothing. When my husband Antonio died in a construction accident back in 1978, I had a 6-year-old son and exactly $200 in our checking account. No degree, no family money, just a widow's determination and a head for numbers I'd inherited from my accountant father. I worked the overnight shift at a packaging plant while teaching myself corporate finance from library books. By day, I took online courses. By the time Caio graduated high school, I'd earned my MBA and started investing every spare dollar into undervalued companies, small purchases, strategic moves, building a portfolio while everyone saw just another working-class widow. For 30 years, I quietly acquired shares in Lorenzo Industries, a Chicago commercial real estate empire. Started with 100 shares in 1993, never stopped buying. The Lorenzo family had no idea who kept purchasing their minority stocks through various investment vehicles. My son Caio grew into a handsome, ambitious man. Last year, he brought home Bianca Lorenzo, a 25-year-old heiress with a trust fund and a taste for luxury. I paid for their $300,000 wedding, every cent of it, because I wanted my boy happy. What I got instead was public humiliation and a truth so ugly it almost broke me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you want to understand how a grandmother went from being mocked as a fat old pig to restructuring an entire corporate empire, subscribe and stay with me. This is a story about respect, revenge, and what happens when people forget that age brings power, not weakness. Let me tell you what really happened that Tuesday afternoon in May. The wedding was perfect on paper. Crystal chandeliers, imported roses, a string quartet that cost more than my first car. I wore an emerald green dress I'd had custom tailored, simple but elegant. At 73, I wasn't trying to compete with the young crowd, but I wanted to look dignified for my only son's big day. Bianca's family filled the groom's side of the church. The Lorenzos brought what looked like half of Chicago's elite. I recognized faces from business magazines, society pages, the kind of people who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. They looked at our side, my small collection of old friends, some of Caio's college buddies, my late husband's brother, and his wife, like we were the help. During the reception, I noticed Bianca's mother, Christina, studying me with barely concealed distaste. She leaned over to whisper something to her sister, both of them glancing my way. I caught the word unfortunate floating across the table. I'd dealt with snobs before. 50 years in business teaches you to ignore the ones who judge you by your zip code instead of your balance sheet. But what came next was different. The toasts began around 8 o'clock. Caio's best man told a sweet story about our friendship. Christina gave a practiced speech about family and legacy that made it sound like the Lorenzos were royalty. Then Bianca stood up. She looked radiant in her $15,000 gown, diamonds glittering at her throat. She thanked everyone for coming, praised her new husband, and then her eyes landed on me. Her voice turned sharp, cutting through the polite murmur of conversation. She gestured toward my table with her champagne flute, making sure every single person in that ballroom could see exactly who she meant. She told the crowd they should all meet the fat old pig they'd have to deal with now. Said it with a smile, like it was a joke everyone should be in on. The laughter from her side of the room hit me like a physical blow. Not polite chuckles, but real laughter. Her cousins, her sorority sisters, even some of the older relatives smiled and nodded like she'd made a valid point. I felt 300 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My face burned. My hands shook so badly I had to set down my water glass. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. But then, I looked at my son. Caio sat frozen at the head table, his face flushed red. He didn't defend me, didn't stand up, didn't tell his new wife that she'd just insulted the woman who raised him alone, who worked 2 jobs so he could have piano lessons and summer camp, who paid for the very wedding where she was being humiliated. He just sat there and let it happen. That's when I saw Lorenzo himself, Bianca's father, across the room. He'd gone completely white. His eyes were locked on me, and I watched recognition dawn across his face like sunrise. He stood up slowly, nearly knocking over his chair. He started walking toward me, weaving between tables, ignoring his wife's confused questions. When he reached my table, he leaned down and asked me in a low, urgent voice if I was Margaret Albuquerque. I told him I was. He asked if I was the same Margaret Albuquerque who'd been appointed to his company's board of directors last month. The same one scheduled to assume the CEO position on Monday morning. I told him that was correct. The color drained from his face completely. He glanced back at his daughter, still standing at the microphone looking pleased with herself, then back at me. He started stammering something about not knowing, about his daughter being young and stupid, about how there must have been some misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. His princess had just publicly mocked the woman who now controlled 51% of his family's business. I stood up, smoothed down my dress, and gathered my purse. I told him we'd discuss the company's future in my office Monday morning. Then I walked out of that ballroom with my head high, even though my heart was shattering with every step. I didn't cry until I got home. Then I sat in my kitchen, still in that emerald dress, and let myself break down. Not because of Bianca's cruel words. I'd been called worse by better people. No, I cried because my son had sat silent while it happened. 31 years I'd spent building him up, sacrificing everything so he could have opportunities I never had. And when it mattered most, he chose her family's approval over his own mother's dignity. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene, wondering what I'd done wrong, where I'd failed as a mother. But around 3 a.m, something shifted inside me. The grief started hardening into something else. By sunrise, I knew exactly what I had to do. Monday morning, I arrived at Lorenzo Industries headquarters at 7:30. The building was a gleaming tower in the Loop, 40 stories of glass and steel that I'd watched being built back in 1998. I'd bought my first significant block of shares the day after the ribbon cutting. The receptionist looked startled when I introduced myself. She'd probably heard about the wedding disaster already. Chicago society loves scandal, and a public insult at a $300,000 reception was premium gossip. I took the executive elevator to the 40th floor. The CEO's office was exactly as I remembered from my site visit 3 months ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, Brazilian walnut desk, Italian leather chairs. All of it about to become mine. Lorenzo was waiting, looking like he hadn't slept. His lawyer sat beside him, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia who'd represented the family for 20 years. They had a stack of documents prepared. He tried to explain. Told me Bianca had been under stress, that she didn't understand the situation, that she'd been raised to speak her mind perhaps too freely. He suggested we could all sit down together, work out a family understanding. I let him finish. Then I opened my briefcase and pulled out my own files. I'd spent the weekend doing research I should have done months ago. See, when your son starts dating a wealthy girl and you're about to become her father's boss, you look into things, really look. What I found was fascinating. Lorenzo Industries had always presented itself as a family empire built by Bianca's great-grandfather in 1952. The company literature, the website, even the plaques in the lobby told that story. But I had access to the original incorporation documents now. I laid them out on that Brazilian walnut desk. The papers showed that in 1952, Lorenzo's grandfather had entered a partnership with another man. My grandfather, Alberto Albuquerque, who'd invested the capital while the Lorenzos provided the real estate expertise. They'd split it 50-50 back then. But over the decades, the Lorenzo family had bought out what they thought were all the Albuquerque shares. What they didn't know was that my grandfather had kept a small percentage in a separate trust, one that passed to my father when he died, and then to me. That small percentage had been my foundation. For 30 years, every time Lorenzo Industries needed cash and issued new shares, I bought them. Every time a minor investor wanted out, I made an offer. Slowly, quietly, patiently, I'd been rebuilding my family's stake in the company my grandfather had helped create. By 2024, I didn't just own shares, I owned control. Patricia the lawyer went pale as she reviewed my documents. She started calculating on her tablet, cross-referencing with their own records. Finally, she looked at Lorenzo and told him it was legitimate. Airtight. I held 51% of voting shares. Lorenzo tried to appeal to sentiment. He talked about his family's legacy, about his grandfather's vision, about maintaining tradition. He suggested I could be a silent partner, collect dividends, let them run things as always. I reminded him that his daughter had called me a fat old pig in front of 300 people, including most of his business partners and clients. I asked him how much respect he thought that showed for tradition. Then came the part that truly broke my heart. I told them I needed to see all executive financial records, particularly anything involving external contractors or family member expenses. It was standard procedure for any new CEO. Patricia tried to object, but Lorenzo waved her off. He'd already lost the bigger battle. What did a few expense reports matter? I spent the rest of that Monday in my new office reviewing 5 years of financial records. By noon, I'd found the first discrepancy. By 3 o'clock, I'd found 6 more. By the time I left at 7, I had enough irregularities flagged to keep forensic accountants busy for months. But the detail that made my blood run cold was a consulting contract from 18 months ago. Lorenzo Industries had paid $100,000 to a marketing firm called CL Strategies. The signature approving the payment was mine, except I hadn't signed it. I'd never heard of CL Strategies, and in 2023, I hadn't even been on the board yet. I sat in my new office as the sun set over Lake Michigan, holding that forged document in my hands. The signature was good, I had to admit. Someone had practiced. But I've been signing my name for 73 years. I know every loop and curl. I pulled out my phone and searched for CL Strategies. The business registration led me to a Chicago address. The listed owner made my stomach drop. Caio Antonio Albuquerque. My son. He'd forged my signature to approve payment to his own fake company. $100,000 in fraud, using his position as the CEO's future son-in-law to bypass normal checks. And suddenly, I understood why he'd been so eager to marry into the Lorenzo family. Why he'd never questioned me paying for the wedding. Why he'd sat silent when Bianca humiliated me. He hadn't been embarrassed by her behavior. He'd been terrified I'd discover what he'd done. I didn't confront Caio immediately. 50 years in business taught me that information is worthless if you use it too soon. Instead, I played the part everyone expected, the hurt, aging mother still reeling from wedding day humiliation. Tuesday morning, Caio called. His voice had that careful tone children use when they're trying to manage a parent they consider fragile. He said Bianca wanted to apologize, that they'd like to come over for dinner that weekend, that we should talk about what happened. I told him that would be nice. Let my voice shake just a little. Let him think I was grateful for the olive branch. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator named Patricia Monroe. Not the Lorenzo family lawyer, a different Patricia entirely. This one specialized in financial fraud and had 20 years with the Chicago PD before going private. I gave her the forged document and told her to find everything. Every account Caio had touched, every transaction he'd made, every connection to Lorenzo Industries. I wanted the full picture before I made my move. Wednesday, I had lunch with Christina, Bianca's mother. She'd called asking to meet, probably trying to smooth things over now that she understood who I actually was. We met at a French place in Lincoln Park where she could be seen with the right people. She apologized for her daughter's behavior, blamed it on youth and wedding stress. Then she spent 20 minutes subtly trying to figure out my plans for the company. Would I be making major changes? Did I intend to stay in the CEO role long term? Perhaps I'd consider stepping back, enjoying retirement. I played confused. Mentioned my age several times. Asked her to explain some basic business concepts I'd been working with for decades. Let her think I was in over my head, that I'd been lucky in investments but didn't really understand corporate management. She relaxed visibly. By the end of lunch, she was practically patting my hand, telling me not to worry, suggesting that Lorenzo could stay on in an advisory role to help me navigate the complexities. I thanked her sweetly and said that sounded wonderful. Thursday, Patricia the investigator sent her preliminary report. It was worse than I'd imagined. CL Strategies was just the beginning. Caio had created 3 other shell companies over the past 2 years, all supposedly providing services to Lorenzo Industries. Marketing consultation, IT services, business development. Each contract approved with forged documents bearing my signature. Total fraud, $473,000. My son had stolen nearly $500,000 from a company I partly owned, using my identity, all to fund a lifestyle that would impress his wealthy in-laws. The investigator tracked the money to luxury purchases. A BMW he claimed was a gift from a friend. Designer clothes. A down payment on a condo in a building where Bianca's cousins lived. He'd built an entire life on fraud and lies, and when I paid for his wedding, I was actually funding my own humiliation. Friday afternoon, Caio and Bianca came to my house. She wore a contrite expression that probably worked on people who didn't know better. She apologized for her words at the wedding, claimed she'd been drinking too much, that she didn't mean what she said. I accepted her apology graciously, offered them coffee, asked about their honeymoon plans. Caio relaxed as the evening went on. He started talking about his work, his plans, his connections through the Lorenzo family. He mentioned how helpful it would be to have me in the CEO role, how we could work together, build something really special. I asked him about his consulting work, mentioned I'd seen some contracts in the company files, watched his face carefully. He barely flinched, told me he'd done some freelance work before the wedding, just small projects, nothing major. Said Lorenzo had hired him to help with some marketing initiatives because he understood the younger market demographic. The lie came so easily, so smoothly, like he'd practiced it 100 times. Bianca jumped in, backing him up, saying her father always liked to support family businesses. They tag-teamed the deception beautifully, each reinforcing the other's story. I smiled and nodded, told them it was wonderful that they were building their careers together, mentioned how proud I was of Caio's initiative. As they left, Bianca hugged me, told me she was glad we could move past the wedding incident, that she looked forward to having me as family. I watched them drive away in Caio's BMW, the one purchased with stolen money, and felt something cold settle into my chest. My son wasn't just a fraud. He was skilled at it. The forged signatures, the fake companies, the smooth lies when confronted. This wasn't a desperate mistake. This was calculated theft. And Bianca either knew and didn't care, or was too blinded by luxury to ask questions. Saturday morning, I called my lawyer. James Chen had handled my business affairs for 15 years. I told him everything, sent him Patricia's investigator report, asked him what my options were. He called back 3 hours later with a plan that was both simple and devastating. By Monday, everyone would know exactly who they'd been dealing with. James Chen arrived at my house Sunday morning with 2 associates and enough legal documents to fill a briefcase. We spread everything across my dining room table, the same table where I'd taught Caio his multiplication tables 30 years ago. The evidence was damning. 4 shell companies, 16 forged documents, $473,000 in fraudulent payments. Patricia's investigation had traced every dollar: the BMW, the designer wardrobe, the down payment on the condo in Gold Coast, where monthly fees alone cost more than most people's mortgages. James explained my options. Criminal prosecution would be straightforward. The FBI handles fraud cases involving amounts over $100,000. Caio would likely face 5 to 10 years in federal prison. I sat there looking at my son's signature on incorporation documents, on rental agreements, on purchase contracts for luxury goods. At 73, I'd never imagined I'd be deciding whether to send my only child to prison. James asked me what I wanted to do. I told him to prepare the criminal complaint, but hold off filing it. I wanted to handle this my way first. Monday morning, I called a full board meeting at Lorenzo Industries. The board consisted of Lorenzo himself, his brother Marco, his cousin Beatrice, 2 outside directors, and now me. I'd sent the agenda Sunday night. Financial irregularities requiring immediate board action. They arrived at 9 o'clock looking confused. Lorenzo kept trying to catch my eye, probably assuming this was about normal operational issues. His family members barely acknowledged me beyond polite nods. I started the presentation at exactly 9:15, displayed the first forged document on the conference room screen, my signature, allegedly approving a $100,000 payment to CL Strategies. Asked if anyone recognized the company. Blank stares all around. Showed them the business registration, Caio's name as owner. Watched comprehension dawn on their faces. Then I showed them the rest. 3 more shell companies, 16 forged documents, $473,000 in fraudulent payments, all approved with my forged signature, all going directly to my son. Beatrice, who'd smiled indulgently at me like I was a confused grandmother just last week, went pale. She'd signed off on some of these payments herself, trusting that my signature meant approval. Marco started blustering about how they'd been deceived, how this reflected poorly on due diligence, how they'd been victims too. I let him talk himself out. Then I displayed the next document, a forensic analysis showing that every single fraudulent contract had been processed through the executive approval system during times when Lorenzo himself was the final sign-off. Technically, as CEO, he bore responsibility for every dollar that left the company. The outside directors started taking notes. In any lawsuit, the board's response to fraud would be scrutinized. They needed to be on record acting decisively. Lorenzo tried to salvage the situation. He suggested we could handle this quietly, family matter, no need to involve authorities. Caio could pay the money back, maybe agree to some counseling, we could all move forward. I asked him if he'd extend the same courtesy to any other employee who'd stolen $500,000 through identity fraud. He went quiet. Then I told them my proposal. The board would vote to launch a formal investigation into all financial irregularities over the past 3 years. We'd bring in external auditors, a forensic accounting firm, maybe even the FBI. Every questionable transaction would be examined, every signature verified, every payment tracked. The outside directors nodded. From a liability standpoint, this was their only option. If they tried to cover up fraud and it came out later, they'd all be liable. Lorenzo looked trapped. His family had run this company like a personal piggy bank for decades. Nepotistic hiring, generous expense accounts, country club memberships charged to the business. None of it illegal necessarily, but all of it questionable under scrutiny. Marco started objecting, talking about airing dirty laundry, damaging the company's reputation. I reminded him that I held 51% of voting shares. If I wanted this investigation, it would happen with or without board approval. The vote was 5-2. Only Lorenzo and Marco voted against. After the meeting, Lorenzo asked to speak privately. We stood in his corner office, my office now technically, though I'd let him keep it temporarily while I set up my own space. He begged me to reconsider. Told me Bianca was devastated, that this would destroy their family's reputation, that Caio was still my son no matter what he'd done. I told him his daughter had called me a fat old pig in front of 300 people. I told him that while I sat in humiliation, he'd allowed my son to steal from our company. I told him that every time he'd approved one of those fraudulent payments, he'd been complicit in the theft. Then I told him to vacate the corner office by end of week. I'd be taking over completely. He tried to argue about his employment contract, his years of service. I reminded him that employment contracts have ethics clauses. Failure to prevent fraud is grounds for immediate termination. He left looking 10 years older than when I'd walked in that morning. Patricia, the investigator, called that evening. She'd found more. Caio's fake companies hadn't just billed Lorenzo Industries. They'd created false invoices with at least 3 other Chicago firms, all using forged documents claiming partnerships or recommendations from major corporations. My son wasn't just a thief. He was a criminal enterprise. Tuesday morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Bianca arrived at my office without an appointment, crying so hard she could barely speak. Her makeup ran in dark streaks down her face, her hands shook, and she looked nothing like the confident heiress who'd mocked me 2 weeks ago. My assistant asked if I wanted security to escort her out. I told her to let Bianca in. She collapsed into the chair across from my desk, told me she needed to confess something, said it had been eating at her since the wedding, that she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't pretend anymore. The insult at the wedding hadn't been spontaneous, drunken cruelty. It had been planned. Caio had spent months before the wedding poisoning her against me. He'd told her I was unstable, controlling, that I manipulated him through guilt about his dead father. He'd said I was jealous of their relationship, that I'd try to sabotage their marriage, that I'd demanded to control every wedding decision. He'd painted me as a toxic, overbearing mother who couldn't let him grow up, told Bianca that the only way to establish boundaries was to publicly embarrass me, to show me I couldn't control their lives anymore. The insult had been his idea. He'd even helped her phrase it, told her exactly when to say it for maximum impact. He'd promised it would free them both from my interference. She'd believed him, trusted him completely, never questioned why his own mother would be such a monster. After all, he was her husband. Why would he lie? Now she'd seen the evidence of fraud. Her father had shown her everything: the forged signatures, the fake companies, the stolen money. And suddenly, Caio's stories about his controlling mother didn't make sense anymore. She asked me why he'd done it. Why steal when I'd given him everything? Why marry her at all? I told her the truth. He'd married her for access. The Lorenzo name opened doors in Chicago that a working-class kid from Bridgeport could never access on his own. With her family connections, he could pretend to be something he wasn't: successful, wealthy, legitimate. The fake companies weren't just about stealing money. They were about creating a resume, building credibility. Every contract with Lorenzo Industries became a reference for the next scam. Look, he could tell potential clients, I work with the Lorenzos. I must be trustworthy. She'd been a trophy wife and a business credential, all in one. Bianca asked me what I planned to do, whether I'd really send him to prison. I told her I hadn't decided yet, but I also told her that she needed to make her own choices now, independent of whatever my son had told her to think or feel. She left my office still crying, but quieter now, thoughtful. Wednesday brought the forensic auditors. A team of 4 descended on Lorenzo Industries with the kind of thoroughness that makes guilty people sweat. They requested access to every financial system, every bank account, every payment record going back 5 years. Lorenzo tried to limit their scope, claiming some records were private family matters. The lead auditor, a woman named Sandra who'd worked fraud cases for the SEC, politely informed him that as majority shareholder, I'd authorized complete access. If he interfered, she'd include that obstruction in her report. By Friday, Sandra had preliminary findings. The $473,000 in obvious fraud was just the surface. When they tracked every payment to shell companies and suspicious vendors, the number climbed past $800,000. Some of the companies weren't even Caio's. They belonged to Lorenzo's nephew, his cousin's husband, even Marco's son. The Lorenzo family had been treating the company as a personal ATM for years. They'd just been better at hiding it than Caio. Sandra asked me what I wanted to do with the information. I could report everyone, clean house completely, or handle it selectively. I thought about that all weekend. 73 years of life teaches you that absolute justice often creates absolute chaos. Sometimes you have to be strategic. Monday morning, I called individual meetings with each family member whose fraud Sandra had uncovered. One by one, they came to my office, and I showed them exactly what I knew: the fake invoices, the phantom consulting fees, the padded expense reports. I gave them each a choice: resign immediately, pay back every dollar with interest, and sign NDAs promising never to discuss company business again. Or I'd file criminal charges and let the FBI handle it. Marco tried to bluff, told me I couldn't prove anything, that these were legitimate business expenses. I showed him the forensic report, bank records showing his son's consulting company had never actually provided any services. Email trails where Marco explicitly told accounting to approve payments without verification. He signed the resignation letter. Beatrice cried and begged, said her family would be ruined. I reminded her that she'd smiled approvingly when Bianca called me a fat old pig, told her that sometimes ruin is exactly what people deserve. She signed too. By Wednesday, I'd cleared out half the board and 3 layers of executive management. Lorenzo Industries was effectively under new ownership, new leadership, new rules. Only Lorenzo himself remained, and only because his employment contract made firing him expensive. But I'd stripped him of all real authority. He could keep the title VP of Legacy Operations and spend his days reading newspapers in an office on the 32nd floor. Now came the hardest part. I had to deal with my son. Thursday morning, Caio finally called. He'd been avoiding me for a week, probably hoping the whole thing would blow over. His voice was tight with false casualness when he asked if I wanted to meet for lunch. I told him to come to my office at Lorenzo Industries. 2 o'clock. Don't be late. He tried to suggest a restaurant instead, somewhere neutral. I repeated the address and time, then hung up. I spent the morning with James Chen, reviewing exactly how this confrontation would play out. We needed everything documented, every admission, every excuse, every attempt at manipulation. This wasn't just a mother confronting her son anymore. This was a CEO addressing criminal fraud within her company. James brought a court reporter to transcribe everything. We set up in the main conference room, not my office. This needed to feel official, not personal. Caio arrived 15 minutes late, wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000. Purchased with stolen money, I thought. He looked surprised to see James and the court reporter. I told him to sit down. Informed him this was a formal deposition regarding financial irregularities at Lorenzo Industries. Everything he said would be recorded and could be used in legal proceedings. His face went pale. He asked if he needed a lawyer. I told him that was his choice, but either way, this conversation was happening today. He sat down. I started with the simplest question. Had he ever created a company called CL Strategies? He denied it initially, said he didn't know what I was talking about. Then I showed him the incorporation documents with his signature, the bank accounts in his name, the payment records. He switched tactics, admitted to CL Strategies, but claimed it was legitimate, said he'd really provided marketing services to Lorenzo Industries. I asked him to describe those services. What marketing materials had he created? Which campaigns had he managed? What results had he delivered? He stammered through vague answers about brand consultation and market analysis. Nothing specific, nothing real. I showed him the forensic report, explained that investigators had found no work product, no deliverables, no communication with actual marketing departments, just invoices and payments. He tried anger next, raised his voice, said I was humiliating him, that I'd always been controlling, that I couldn't stand to see him successful. I let him yell himself out. Then I asked if he wanted to see the other 3 shell companies we'd uncovered, the forged signatures, the traced payments. He went quiet. I asked him why. Why steal when I'd given him everything? Why lie? Why destroy what we had? He said I wouldn't understand. That I'd worked my whole life and had something to show for it, but he was 31 and still dependent on his mother's money. That everyone in Bianca's world was rich from birth, trust funds, and family businesses, and he'd had to pretend he belonged there. He said he'd needed the money to look like he fit in, to take Bianca to the right restaurants, wear the right clothes, live in the right neighborhood. The wedding alone would have exposed him as the poor kid if I hadn't paid for it. I asked him if he understood that maintaining a lie through fraud was a federal crime. He said he'd planned to pay it all back once he was established, once he'd made his own connections, built his own business. The shell companies were supposed to be temporary, just seed money for his real career. I asked him if he'd encouraged Bianca to insult me at the wedding. He looked away, admitted it had been his idea, said he'd needed to establish boundaries, to show her family he wasn't under my control, that the insult was supposed to prove he'd moved beyond being Mama's boy. I asked him if he understood what he'd sacrificed for that image, his integrity, his relationship with his mother, his freedom, potentially, if this went to trial. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I hadn't decided yet, but I explained what I'd learned over 73 years. That respect isn't given based on wealth or status. It's earned through honesty, through keeping your word, through standing by the people who stand by you. I told him that every sacrifice I'd made after his father died, the overnight shifts, the community college classes, the years of building a business, had been to give him opportunities, not to make him rich, but to teach him how to build something real. Instead, he'd learned to forge signatures and create fake companies. I told him to go home, think about what kind of man he wanted to be, whether he wanted to face this honestly or keep lying until the FBI made the choice for him. He left without looking at me. James asked if I was ready to file charges. The evidence was overwhelming. Any prosecutor would take this case. I told him to prepare everything but wait for my signal. I had one more conversation to have first. Friday evening, I invited Bianca to my house. Not the office this time. This needed to be personal. She arrived looking terrified. I made tea, just like I used to when she first started dating Kaio, back when I'd hoped she might become the daughter I never had. I told her I'd decided what to do about her husband, but first, she needed to decide what she wanted to do about her marriage. Bianca sat in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a teacup she wasn't drinking from. She told me she'd filed for separation that morning. Her lawyer was drawing up papers. She'd moved back to her parents' house. She said she couldn't stay married to someone who'd used her, who'd orchestrated her humiliation of me, who'd built their entire relationship on lies. Whatever she'd thought Kaio was, the forensic reports had shown her the truth. I asked if she'd told her father yet. She shook her head, said Lorenzo had been walking around the house like a ghost, barely speaking, since he'd learned about the extent of the fraud. Good, I thought. Let him sit with the consequences of running his company like a family charity. I told Bianca what I'd decided to do about Kaio, but I also told her what I expected from her going forward. First, the fraud. I would report everything to federal authorities, all $863,000 that forensic auditors had uncovered, not just Kaio's theft, but every fraudulent payment by every Lorenzo family member. The FBI could sort out who got charged with what. Bianca started crying again, said her family would be destroyed, that the scandal would ruin them. I reminded her that her family had treated my company like their personal piggy bank for years, that her father had enabled my son's fraud by running such a loose operation, that her mother had sneered at me over lunch while spending profits from inflated expense reports. Then I told her the second part. Lorenzo Industries would be completely restructured. New board, new management, new policies. Anyone who wanted to work there would earn their position based on qualifications, not family connections. She could stay on. She actually had a legitimate role in property acquisitions, unlike her cousins who just collected paychecks for phantom work. But she'd report to new leadership, follow new rules, and accept that the Lorenzo family business was now the Albuquerque family business. Her father could keep his VP title and salary until retirement. Generous severance for decades of work, even if those decades included looking the other way at fraud. But he'd never control another decision in this company. She asked what would happen to Kaio. I told her I'd hired the best criminal defense attorney in Chicago, paid the retainer myself, because even after everything, he was still my son. I wouldn't abandon him to face federal charges alone, but I also wouldn't protect him from consequences. The attorney's job was to negotiate the best plea deal possible, not to help him escape justice. Caio had committed serious crimes. He needed to accept responsibility. The attorney estimated 18 months to 3 years in minimum security prison, followed by probation and restitution payments. If Caio cooperated fully, showed genuine remorse, paid back every dollar, he might avoid the worst. But his life as he'd known it was over. The BMW would be seized. The Gold Coast condo would be sold. The designer wardrobe would be liquidated. Everything purchased with stolen money would be returned to its rightful owners. Bianca asked if I'd forgive him eventually. I told her I didn't know. Forgiveness isn't automatic just because someone's your child. He'd have to earn it back, piece by piece, through years of honest living. Maybe by the time he got out of prison, we could start rebuilding something real, or maybe we couldn't. Some things, once broken, don't get fixed. She left around 8 o'clock, looking older than her 25 years. Welcome to adulthood, I thought, where actions have consequences and family loyalty doesn't excuse crimes. Monday morning, I met with FBI agents. 2 of them, seasoned white-collar crime investigators, spent 6 hours reviewing evidence. They told me this was one of the clearest fraud cases they'd seen in years. Multiple perpetrators, obvious pattern of behavior, excellent documentation. They'd start with Caio, since his crimes were most egregious. Then they'd work through the other family members. Some might avoid charges through cooperation agreements. Others might face trial. By Wednesday, federal marshals arrested Caio at his condo. I wasn't there. Couldn't watch my son being handcuffed and read his rights. James called to tell me it had gone smoothly. Caio had cooperated, hadn't tried to run or destroy evidence. That evening, the story hit the news. Chicago real estate heir arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Every local channel led with it. The papers ran it, front page. My phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting comments, old friends calling in shock, business associates expressing sympathy or perhaps just checking whether I was still a reliable partner. I didn't answer most of them. Just sat in my house, the same house where I'd raised Caio alone, where I'd taught him right from wrong, where I'd thought I was building a good man and let myself grieve. Because that's what this was, grief. Not for what Caio had done, but for who I'd thought he was. That version of my son had never existed. I'd been living in a fantasy while he'd been building his criminal empire. Thursday morning, I went back to work. Lorenzo Industries needed a CEO, and I'd signed up for the job. The fraud investigation, the federal charges, my son facing prison, none of that changed my responsibilities. New board members were being vetted, new management being recruited, new policies being written. We had a company to save from the people who'd been destroying it from inside, and I had a legacy to protect, the one my grandfather started in 1952, the one I'd spent 30 years rebuilding. My son had tried to steal it. He'd failed. Caio accepted a plea deal 18 months after his arrest. 30 months in federal prison, 3 years supervised probation, full restitution of $473,000 plus interest. He'd serve his time at a minimum security facility in Illinois, eligible for early release after 20 months with good behavior. The day of his sentencing, I sat in the courtroom, watched him stand before the judge in a cheap suit. The expensive ones had been seized months ago. He read a prepared statement about taking responsibility, about understanding the harm he'd caused, about wanting to rebuild his life honestly. I wanted to believe him. Maybe someday I would. 3 other Lorenzo family members faced charges. Marco got 18 months and permanent ban from corporate officer positions. Beatrice's husband received probation and community service. Her cousin took a cooperation deal in exchange for testimony. Lorenzo himself avoided criminal charges, but paid $800,000 in civil settlements. His reputation in Chicago business circles was destroyed. The man who'd run a prestigious family empire for 30 years would be remembered for enabling fraud and nepotism. Christina filed for divorce 6 months after the indictments came down, took half of what remained of Lorenzo's personal wealth, and moved to Arizona. She sends me a Christmas card every year now. We're not friends, but we maintain polite contact. Bianca surprised me. After the divorce finalized, she enrolled in business school at Northwestern. Real classes, real work, no family name to coast on. She still works at Lorenzo Industries, now officially renamed Albuquerque Real Estate Holdings. But she's proven herself capable. Manages a 7-person acquisition team, closed deals worth $40 million last year. We have dinner once a month. She calls me Margaret. Never Mom, and I respect that boundary. She's building herself into someone genuine, someone I'm starting to admire. Patricia Monroe, the investigator who uncovered the fraud, became our Director of Internal Compliance. Turns out having someone who can smell dishonesty from 3 rooms away is valuable in real estate. She built us an ethics program that's become an industry model. James Chen officially retired last year but consults for our legal department twice weekly. Says investigating Cayo's fraud was the most satisfying case of his career, not because of the conviction, but because I handled it with integrity when I could have taken easier paths. The Lorenzo siblings who kept clean during the fraud years got to keep their jobs. 2 of them are actually competent. One runs our property management division quite well. The other, Bianca's youngest uncle, handles community relations and tenant services. They learned that family name doesn't guarantee employment, but honest work does. My old friends from the packaging plant days, I hired 3 of them into administrative positions when I restructured the company. They'd supported me through every struggle of the past 50 years. Seemed only fair to share success now that I had it. I moved into a new place last year. Sold the house where I'd raised Cayo. Too many ghosts. Too many memories of a son who'd turned out to be someone else entirely. Bought a condo on Lakeshore Drive with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. At 74, I finally have the luxury apartment I spent 50 years working toward. The company stabilized within 2 years of the restructuring. Profitable, ethical, growing steadily. We hired a younger CEO last month, a woman with Stanford MBA and 20 years in commercial real estate. I'll stay on as board chair, but she'll run day-to-day operations. At 74, I've earned the right to step back. I travel now. Spent 3 months in Portugal last year, visiting the region where my grandfather emigrated from. Took a river cruise through Europe, something Antonio and I always planned, but never got to do. Went to Japan and Vietnam and Thailand, places I'd only read about. I fund 3 scholarships annually for children of single mothers pursuing business degrees. Anonymous donations, no publicity. Just helping the next generation of people like me, the ones who start with nothing but determination. The money I'd set aside for Cayo's inheritance? It went into a foundation supporting financial literacy education for young people. Teaching them what happens when you live beyond your means, when you choose image over substance, when you build a life on lies. My son gets out of prison in 8 months. He writes me letters occasionally, short ones, awkward ones, where he tries to explain how therapy's helping him understand his choices, how he's working minimum wage jobs in the prison commissary, learning what actual work feels like when you can't fake competence. I write back, brief responses, encouragement about his rehabilitation. No promises about what comes after. Maybe we'll rebuild something. Maybe we won't. Some betrayals cut too deep for complete healing. But I'll give him the chance to try, just like I gave him every chance in life before he threw them away. I learned something through all of this. Respect isn't about age or motherhood or sacrifice. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve. For 70 years, I'd been proving myself to people who didn't matter, fighting for recognition from people who judged me by my address instead of my character. Now I know better. The people who matter see your value without needing proof. Everyone else can watch from a distance while you build the life you earned. At 74, I'm not a widow struggling to survive anymore. Not the embarrassing mother-in-law to be mocked at fancy weddings. I'm the woman who turned whispered stock purchases into a real estate empire, who survived public humiliation and came back stronger, who sent her own son to prison rather than compromise her principles. Some people called me cold for that, heartless even. They said a real mother would have protected him. But real mothers teach their children consequences. Real mothers show them that love doesn't mean enabling destruction. Real mothers demonstrate strength, even when it breaks their hearts. I'm looking at Lake Michigan right now, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. At 74, I've got a company to chair, trips to plan, a scholarship foundation to manage, and a life I built with my own hands. The young woman who was widowed at 27 with $200 and a child to raise? She'd be proud of who I became. And that's the only approval I've ever really needed. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to make a tough choice between family loyalty and doing what's right. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about strength, survival, and refusing to be counted out. Hit that notification bell. Next week's story will show you why underestimating grandmothers is always a mistake.